Hi everyone, welcome to my final summative learning presentation. My name is Ruby Hyatt. I'm a second year concurrent education student in the primary junior stream. I am taking this class because I want to continue my learning to be a better friend and ally to Indigenous peoples. I believe it's my responsibility as a future educator to be as knowledgeable as possible. Today, I will be summarizing 5 main themes from the Intro to Indigenous Studies class: preservation and revitalization, environmental justice, education, understanding privilege, and Indigenous pride. For each theme, I will briefly discuss some of the core class content, mainly a few of the class readings or videos, followed by new things currently expanding our learning, including books, documentaries, news articles, and ending each theme with my personal reflection. Throughout this presentation, you will also see a variety of mostly Canadian Indigenous artists. For our first topic, we have preservation and revitalization. Back to the Land, Preserving Indigenous Language, a plant medicine educator sharing his knowledge of plant medicine while preserving their Anishinaabemowin names and Indigenous knowledge. Heartbeat of a Nation is about a father teaching traditional drum-making skills while passing down Dean cultural knowledge, skills, and teachings to the next generation. Drumming My Way Home is about Colin's story and how his language, culture, family, and land all shape his identity. Although he lost some of his language, he still carries important cultural teachings from his community. His experience in both school, work, and family life show that even when his identity feels uncertain, culture and his relationships remain a strong part of who he is. Now we will be talking about other things going on in the world, or sources I found. In her TED Talk, Lindsay Morcom explains how Indigenous language is deeply connected through culture, identity, worldviews, and community, not just communication. She discusses how these languages are endangered through colonization and residential schools, which disrupts language learning across generations. Malcolm argues that saving Indigenous languages requires community action, education, government support, and long-term commitment, because protecting Indigenous languages is an important part of truth and reconciliation and culture survival. The BBC Kids News article explains how Indigenous youth are helping their language stay alive by learning, speaking, and sharing them. It highlights how residential schools and colonization caused many Indigenous languages to be lost across generations, but young people are now working to reconnect with them through family, books, apps, and community learning. Overall, this article shows that young people play an important role in preserving language, culture, and identity. My reflection. This topic is strongly connected to education for me. It made me think about how school can either support or disconnect students from their language, culture, and identity. Since colonial education systems and residential schools play such a major role in disrupting Indigenous language and knowledge, education today also has a huge responsibility. This theme made me realize the importance of learning from people of all ages. Grassy Narrows First Nation filed a lawsuit against both the provincial and federal governments over the long-term impacts of decades of mercury contamination on their land, which violates their duties under Treaty 3. This article shows that the lasting effect of environmental harm on Indigenous communities due to mercury contamination affects not only health, but also the food systems and traditional ways of life. Autumn Peltier is a 15-year-old water protector speaking at the United Nations about the importance of clean water and the need to protect water for future generations. She explains that her advocacy work is done to honor her great-aunt Josephine. Her activism is rooted in family and traditional teachings as her responsibility to protect the water. She shares Indigenous teachings and that water is alive and has a spirit. Water is how human life begins in the mother's womb, and that water is connected to birth, survival, and future generations. She also points out that Canada is not considered a third world country, yet many Indigenous communities are still living in third world conditions, without access to clean drinking water. Autumn emphasizes that real change only happens when elders and youth are both included in the decision making. If you want to learn more about her, I have provided links to children's books about her activism and the trailer for her documentary. Boil Alert follows Lily Black as she learns about boil water advisories in Indigenous communities while also reconnecting with her identity, culture, and teachings about the Red Road. The documentary highlights how unsafe water is an ongoing reality for many Indigenous communities and highlights that water is sacred, deeply connected to health, land, and future generations. APNT offers many Indigenous children's television programs, including Chums, which is available in many languages, including Cree. The show focuses on a group of animal friends, and it teaches children about their relationships with animals, the environment, and Mother Earth. My reflection. This topic has helped me understand that environmental issues in Indigenous communities are about much more than just pollution or access to clean drinking water. Water and land are deeply connected to health, culture, identity, teaching, and traditional ways of life. As a future teacher, this made me realize that I can include lessons about the environment that highlight Indigenous perspectives and youth activism. Books and programs for children help share Indigenous knowledge and connect kids to the environment. Using children's books and resources with Indigenous perspectives in the classroom is a way to teach about environmental responsibility while also supporting identity, culture, and community. This documentary shows how Indigenous youth, especially Shannon, use their voices to determine fair and safe education for First Nations children. It highlights youth activism, education equality, and the importance of advocacy for equal opportunities in school. Sinclair explains that reconciliation in education cannot stop simply at acknowledging the past or teaching about residential schools once a year. They argue that school needs to actively include Indigenous knowledge, voices, and perspectives throughout the curriculum in order to create real change and more respectful learning environments. In Winnipeg, 800 attendees gather for the first ever Mamatuich Conference, focused on creating more inclusive and culturally safe education for Indigenous students by helping educators better understand Indigenous worldviews, ideas, languages, and traditions. My reflection. This topic helped me understand that education for Indigenous students is about much more than just academics. It also connects to equity, identity, belonging, and access to opportunities. I noticed that true reconciliation in education means more than just teaching about residential schools once a year. It's about Indigenous knowledge, perspectives, and voices that should be meaningfully included throughout the curriculum. As a future teacher, this makes me reflect on the kinds of classrooms I want to create. I want students to feel represented, respected, and connected to what they are learning. Teachers play an important role in supporting reconciliation through the choices we make in our teaching. In her TED Talk, Peggy explores how privilege operates in everyday life, often invisibly, giving certain groups unearned advantages while others face systemic obstacles. She emphasizes that recognizing one's own privilege, whether based on race, gender, or other social categories, is not about feeling guilty. It's about increasing awareness. Education can foster compassion and motivate people to support equity and challenge unjust systems. She highlights that studying privilege is a crucial step towards creating fair and more empathetic societies. In her TED Talk, Tiffany Jenna explains that privilege often operates quietly, giving some people unearned benefits. She emphasizes that identifying privilege is not about blame, but about awareness. It's about how recognizing these dynamics empower individuals to take meaningful action towards inclusion, equity, and social change. Sandra's letter challenges non-Inuit people to recognize their privilege in ways that benefit them from systemic racism in Nunavut. She argues that humility, listening, and creating spaces for Inuit leadership creates self-determination. She explains that proximity to Inuit culture or living up north does not make someone an expert, and they are not entitled to speak for Inuit peoples. APTN guides outlines for key principles in being an effective ally to Indigenous communities, emphasizing education, active listening, respect for sovereignty, and supporting Indigenous-led initiatives. True allyship is ongoing and requires humility, reflection, and ongoing action to challenge systemic injustices and amplify Indigenous voices. My reflection. This topic made me think incredibly deep about what privilege looks like in everyday life, and how, as a white woman, there are privileges I may not even notice. What stood out to me most was that understanding privilege is not about guilt. It's about being more aware, actively listening, and recognizing the way that systems benefit some people while creating barriers for others. I do not want to speak for Indigenous communities. I want to help uplift Indigenous voices rather than speaking over them. I want to use the privilege I have in a positive way by continuing to learn, listen, and support Indigenous-led perspectives and spaces. Next, we have Indigenous Pride. Go Show the World celebrates Indigenous heroes and shows that kids of all backgrounds can be inspired by their stories, encouraging them to know they can do great things. We Won't Forget You is a song and music video created by students that honors Indigenous history, resilience, while giving a voice to young people through creative expression. The Arctic Winter Games, often called the Olympics of the North, showcase Indigenous athletes competing in traditional Arctic sport that test strength, endurance, and skills. Beyond athletic achievement, the Games emphasize family, community, and cultural traditions passed down to the next generation. The virtual museum, Inuit Worlds from Past to Present, preserves Inuit culture from the 60s to 70s, showcasing objects, videos from elders, and interactive lessons. It allows students and the public to learn about Inuit traditions, games, and daily life, while ensuring elders' knowledge is recorded for future generations. My reflection. This topic helped me understand how Indigenous youth and culture are celebrated and shared in many different ways, from music and sports to storytelling and virtual museums. I really loved how Go Show the World shows how kids of all backgrounds can be inspired by Indigenous heroes and realize they can achieve anything. I first heard about the Arctic Winter Games on TikTok, but this article highlights not only athletic skill, but also the importance of family, community, and passing down traditions to the next generation. As a future teacher, this made me realize how powerful it can be to include Indigenous stories, including music, sports, and digital resources in the classroom. These programs show that learning about culture can be engaging, meaningful, and inspiring to students to help better understand their identity, community, and resilience. In conclusion, this course has made me think deeper about what true respect, action, and allyship really looks like. It helped me realize that learning about Indigenous peoples is not only about the past, but also about current issues, including resilience, culture, identity, education, environment, and privilege. I want to share not only some of the more positive and inspiring parts of this course, but also some of the lesser-known topics like the environmental issues and inequality, because those are also important parts of understanding the Indigenous experience today. I am really glad this course was taught in so many different ways through news articles, documentaries, films, readings, and children's books. It made learning feel more meaningful and showed how important it is to include all different kinds of voices, especially youth voices, and different ways of learning. As a future teacher, I hope to continue my learning by taking more Indigenous classes at Brock and attending events on campus, while also trying my best to bring these kinds of meaningful and inclusive perspectives into my own classroom.